This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with his colleague and the director of the Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives, Dr. Anthony Eames. They discuss Dr. Eames' latest book entitled A Voice in Their Own Destiny, Reagan-Thatcher and Public Diplomacy in the Nuclear 1980s. Topics covered include Soviet totalitarianism, public diplomacy, the Reagan-Thatcher relationship, and nuclear policy in the 1980s.
Dr. Anthony Eames, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Roger. It's a real treat.
Well, this is not your first time on Reaganism. You've actually guest hosted a number of times, as our viewers and listeners know. But this is the first time I believe you've been on as a guest. So get ready for the curveballs and fastballs. You're going to be grilled here as we discuss your new book, A Voice in Their Own Destiny, Reagan-Thatcher and Public Diplomacy in the Nuclear 1980s. Of course, you serve as the Director of Scholarly Initiatives here at the Reagan Institute, and you, in that position, you are building a community of scholars who write on President Reagan and the era in which he served, and recently put together the first Age of Reagan conference out in Simi Valley, California, and doing a lot of great things here at the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C. But today we're going to focus on your scholarship, as we like to call you here in the Institute offices, Professor Eames. Before we get into A Voice in Their Own Destiny, which, by the way, you can go on Amazon or any other place you buy books and purchase it. Great read. Just give us a little bit about your background. You, of course, have a PhD from Georgetown University, MA jointly from King's College London and Georgetown University. Grew up out in Chicago, and just, unfortunately for you, you're a Chicago sports fan. But how did you arrive at the world of Reagan?
Well, first off, quick plug. The book is now 30% off on the University of Massachusetts website, so go pick up the paperback. How did I arrive at the world of Reagan? Well, I don't want to say I went kicking and screaming, but he wasn't the Reagan years weren't the thing that really brought me to the topic. I was fascinated by the atomic age, nuclear history. It's such a complex composite field of science and technology, and politicians making critical decisions about exertion of power around the world, and the general public. I mean, some of our greatest kind of cultural moments have revolved around nuclear things. Anyone's a fan of Dr. Strangelove or the new movie Oppenheimer, right? It's one of the biggest hits of the year.
You were decidedly on Oppenheimer, not Barbie, I recall.
That's true. Yes. But when you study nuclear things, you kind of end up studying Ronald Reagan because he had such a central role to play in the nuclear arms race and the nuclear age, and
then ultimately reductions.
Exactly right, and reductions. And he's a surprising figure. Right? Because he really does buck the conventional wisdom of the Cold War, and the Cold War being so much conditioned on nuclear deterrence upheld by the Soviet Union and the United States. And so that complexity, that surprising aspect of Reagan really kind of draws you in over and over and over again. And once you think you have a good sense of who he is and how he thought about nuclear weapons, you find out something more, and that's how you end up writing a book.
Okay. Well, we're gonna talk about that and kind of what surprised you about Reagan, his approach, and why, if you're studying, kind of this nuclear history and during the Cold War, Reagan appears so prominently. But before we get that, another element of the title of your book. It's Reagan-Thatcher and public diplomacy in the nuclear 1980s. Why don't you take a minute to talk about what you mean by the nuclear 1980s? You hit on it just a minute ago, but expand upon it. Then we'll talk about what public diplomacy is, and then we'll focus in on the namesake of this institute.
Well, like any good historian, I begin the nuclear 1980s in the 1970s, right? Historians like to expand and contract normal time.
You got the contrast, right?
Absolutely. but a lot of decades are known for kind of revolving around a central issue. You know, when you think of the 40s, you think of World War II. When you think of the 30s, you think of the Great Depression, right? The 1980s really revolve around nuclear weapons in a way that pervades all aspects of society, not just in the United States, but around the world. So we certainly know here at the Reagan Institute that reducing nuclear arms was key to Reagan's vision for a safer United States, a safer world, and ultimately key to ending the Cold War. We also know that the largest protest in American history up until that time happened in 1982 about nuclear weapons.
Yeah, say more about that. This is kind of a surprising bit of history, or a bit of history that people may be surprised to learn about.
Well, right now we have the UN General Assembly ongoing. And in June 1982, the UN had its special session on disarmament, the second special session on disarmament, the first happening during the Carter years. And nuclear activists, anti-nuclear activists, particularly those who professed allegiance to the idea of a nuclear freeze, and I should get into what I mean by a nuclear freeze. A nuclear freeze would be a halt on the production, the deployment, the testing of nuclear weapons, warheads, delivery systems, what have you. And the idea is that halt would engender kind of a better relationship with the Soviet Union and ultimately lead to a reduction in nuclear weapons. Reagan, of course, wasn't for an immediate freeze. He saw that as giving away negotiating leverage.
And so if you're in favor of nuclear freeze, you generally supported arms control treaties, was kind of kept it at,
Capped it at ceiling
level. Right, right.
And Reagan kind of says,
famously was not.
Reduce, then freeze, right? Reduce, then freeze. Different approaches.
Well, actually, it was build up.
Build up.
So you can get a good negotiation, and then
reduce.
Right.
That's right. So two different approaches to resolving the conflict of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. Both ardently wanted to reduce nuclear weapons, but two different approaches. And so that protest was about pushing forward the freeze approach.
Set the scene. What does that look like? At least at the largest protest.
Central Park, New York.
Central Park, okay.
Spilling out into the streets in New York.
Right, right.
And you have celebrities. I mean, this is a moment where celebrity political culture really does come into the spotlight.
Okay.
Ronald Reagan, of course, is a celebrity himself. You can see many of his movies on YouTube.
Right.
GE Theater, whatnot.
Who was in the crowd that day? The celebrity that was kind of most noticeable, got the most.
Oh, well,
anyone come to mind?
Have to peel back the pages of the book. But any number of singers, right? Any number of actors. I'm sure Paul Newman probably found
right. The cause for the celebs to come out. Okay.
Right. And so this becomes kind of a major kind of cultural moment in the United States about how should American citizens voice their opposition to power.
Right. Right.
Voice their opposition to the U.S. government. And you'll have to remember, the last period of protests in this country was the huge disruption of the Vietnam War.
Right.
So in 1982, you have Reagan kind of reasserting American military power, a willingness to invest in American military capabilities to keep the United States secure from the threat of the Soviet Union. And you have Americans who are still, the Vietnam War, the memories of
the syndrome still reigned,
still very much operative in their mind and in their public imagination. So it's a real contest between these two competing visions about how to go about kind of ending the threat of nuclear war.
Quick follow-up on that, in part driven by my own research. Whereas you definitely had a passionate, vocal element in American society and across the world. I mean, we're going to hit on Thatcher and what was going in the UK and Europe as well. Was it politically significant? Reagan, of course, handily beat Jimmy Carter in 1980. He ran on these issues. It was prominent. Carter made sure that Americans knew that, and what Reagan was saying on defense and the risks involved from Carter's point of view. And then similarly in 84, a landslide win against Mondale, and the midterms in 1982 did not work out for Republicans, but it really didn't ever put Reagan, I think, at political risk, although it was something that people made political hay of. So I guess my question is, you know, it was a movement, a vocal movement, made a lot of noise, got a lot of press, got a lot of coverage. But was it a political threat? I guess.
Sure, let's take it election by
Yeah,
election.
yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, let's first dispense with the maxim of it's the economy, stupid, right?
Right.
Any election can always go by it's the economy, stupid.
And there were problems.
And there were problems. Right. 1980 is one of the moments, one of the few elections in U.S. history where foreign policy really plays a big role. One of the issues at play, we have the Soviet Union marching into Afghanistan and really kind of going on an adventurous tear around the world, sub-Saharan Africa, right, and Latin America. It seems like the Soviet Union's kind of global reach is on the rise.
Yeah.
We have a collapse in strategic arms limitation treaty negotiations, or strategic arms limitation talks.
SALT II talks fail.
SALT II talks fail. And of course, the grand plan for SALT II was really just to put a cap on the number of nuclear weapons, not to reduce nuclear weapons. So you have those two things. But probably the biggest thing, besides those two things, certainly the biggest thing, is the Iran hostage scandal. Right, I think it's something like 444 days
Correct.
the Iranian hostages stayed behind, and Carter is seen as kind of unable to really.
Desert One fails. There's the rescue campaign, and the Iranians, of course, don't release him until after Reagan is sworn in as president on Inauguration Day.
So Carter's seen as kind of indecisive on defense.
Yeah.
Reagan, on the other hand, is seen as just very decisive on defense. To many in the American public, perhaps too decisive on defense. And surprisingly enough, despite all those geopolitical problems that we just laid out,
right,
up until about the middle of summer in 1980, Carter's actually leading the polls and leading on foreign policy, defense policy. That changes when Reagan really starts to put forward his peace through strength program. What is peace through strength? Roger, you and I can talk about peace through strength all day, but at its core, it's about investing in American military capabilities to build up leverage vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, to then compel them to the negotiating table to reach reductions, both in nuclear arms and in conventional forces too, right?
A peace worth having, sort of.
Peace worth having, that's right.
Right.
I do want to make a little asterisk on this. A lot of people see peace through strength as Reagan's first step to nuclear abolition, and frame Reagan as this grand nuclear abolitionist the whole way through.
Right.
I think you and I agree that the priority and the sequencing needs to be precise there. Reagan first believes in the security of the American people, and then only secondly does he aim for nuclear abolition.
I'm glad you raised it. We've talked about this, in our own sessions. But I agree with you. And what Reagan was actually getting after, of course, was dealing with strategic weapons, right? Nuclear weapons. So there was a whole element of kind of strength on the conventional side. And whatever he was going to give up would never put, American security at risk of greater vulnerability. So, and sometimes I agree, people think that almost like the military buildup was sui generis, right? That it was something that you only needed once just to get to the arms reduction agreements. And I think that's a misreading of history. But I defer to the historian to my left. So,
and of course, if the Soviets didn't come to the table, you have the hedge.
Yeah.
Right. You've actually made the investments, and they're there for the security of the American people. So in many ways, Reagan's flexible in the sense that he sees many avenues to securing the United States.
Hey, look, great discussion on this, and certainly I'm not one to kind of seize a discussion on peace through strength, but I do want to get to another feature of the book, and if you can kind of weave it into this discussion, because your focus is on public diplomacy, which of course was a huge piece of what President Reagan emphasized in the administration, and you're kind of threading it into the nuclear 1980s. Why don't you take a minute to explain what public diplomacy was, what Reagan brought to the table, and then some of the idiosyncratic, unique characters that played in the Reagan administration in advancing public diplomacy?
Sure. Well, first, let me tell you why I decided to focus on
Go
public
ahead.
diplomacy. Because last I checked, I didn't see U.S. special forces landing in Moscow to depose Gorbachev. Right. The Cold War comes to an end because people believe that it's come to an end, not just in the White House and in the Kremlin, but American citizens, Europeans, Russians actually accept that it is no longer the predominant phenomenon in international relations and international affairs. And so that's really a case of persuasion being effective. Public diplomacy is all about persuasion. There's a kind of a nuanced scholarly debate about what's the difference between public diplomacy and propaganda. I'm going to shelve that one for now, but for listeners who might be interested in it, trust me, it's in the book. You can get into the introduction. But public diplomacy in the 1970s in the United States was undergoing a sort of crisis. Budgets had flatlined, and there was this fundamental disconnect between kind of public diplomats in field offices, the message that America was preaching, and the very immediate and urgent policy goals for the U.S. national security.
So give me an example where you'd have like Voice of America.
Voice of America.
What was its status and stature in the 70s?
Emphasizing cultural programs rather than trying to push across a certain message about American security, for example, or American commitment to NATO, or American
an administration's political agenda, right?
That's right. That's right. And the idea is that you needed to keep those two separate, because God forbid we politicize
Voice of America.
Voice of America. And Reagan comes into office and says that actually kind of makes us ineffective, right? We're preaching American culture and values, but the policy of the day is essentially a packaging of those values into dealing with the issues that we see around the world. Go ahead.
Yeah, and just to add, because it's not just that he realized it was an important tool, right? But it's also Reagan represented a bit of a shift in how he viewed the Soviet Union and the Cold War. So I'm going to characterize this perhaps in a less scholarly way than you would, but President Carter really felt that the Cold War was a thing of the past, and therefore the ideological struggle between communism and American freedom and democracy was a relic of the early years of the Cold War and not an area of emphasis. It was détente and cooperation, and of course, Reagan felt that the ideological struggle was real. And we were losing, and even if maybe the United States wasn't fighting, but the Soviet Union was, and so therefore, public diplomacy focusing on the ideological struggle was kind of intuitive to him. Like, well, is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the Reagan line, right, that they're the only ones racing. Soviet Union's the only ones racing.
Right.
And the thing that holds back Americans from joining the race is that thing we talked about earlier, Vietnam syndrome.
Right.
There'd been this horrific experience of America engaging in a war abroad, pursue a containment policy that didn't really realize the highest ideals of American security aims. And that does create real trauma in the American public. But so Reagan sees public diplomacy as essential to overcoming this.
And then he has his partner in crime here I want you to hit on, which is uniquely Reagan in terms of people that he knew from his days in Hollywood and California, is Charlie Wick. So kind of bring in Charlie Wick and as you talk about Reagan's approach here.
Yes, Charlie Wick's a fun character. First, let me tell you about the kind of 4 key changes to public diplomacy. Then you'll see how Charlie Wick implements it. The 4 key changes to public diplomacy in the Reagan years. 1, bureaucratic. It used to be kind of cast off into what we call the U.S. Information Agency that no longer exists. It's been kind of reformatted.
You say USIA, just imagine some long bureaucratic corridor that nothing new or impactful is getting done.
The biggest change the Carter administration probably made to the USIA was the name, the U.S. Information Communication Agency, which the Reagan administration changed back. But public diplomacy doesn't just exist within USIA when it comes to Reagan. He introduces a whole bunch of reforms, if you will, to make public diplomacy a whole of government initiative.
Right.
Interagency councils become kind of the norm on public diplomacy. And
And that sounds also bureaucratic, but it's really consequential because
right.
what you're doing is you're getting the appointed officials, right? Those who are appointed to serve in the Reagan administration from quote unquote powerful agencies to talk about public diplomacy, right? So it demonstrates a priority for the administration.
That's right. And this becomes even more important with the kind of technological modernization of public
Talk about that
diplomacy, right?
technology. Yeah.
Right. So probably the golden example here is the introduction of WorldNet, which no longer is around with us today, but at the time it's revolutionary, and it's really the first satellite broadcast network that exists in the world. Prior to Dish TV and whatnot. I guess Dish probably isn't that popular anymore, but and because Reagan had adopted a whole of government approach to public diplomacy, now all of a sudden you see State Department officials, you see Pentagon officials, you see all those kind of leading players in the traditional halls of bureaucratic power in the U.S. government going on live satellite TV, addressing European publics, addressing the global South about the good that U.S. policy is doing to kind of bring an end to the arms race, right? So we're bringing the kind of people who are making the decisions directly to the public and kind of cutting out the middleman in a sense, right? So there's that technological issue. There's the enlistment of the private sector,
right?
Which is classic Reagan, right? We can have the private sector be more effective allies. And then lastly, there's really the thematic transformation, right? The U.S. had undergone this moral reckoning in the 70s with Vietnam and Watergate and Carter's crisis of confidence. And Reagan comes back and shows the U.S. as a shining city on a hill.
Meaning that Reagan believed deeply that there were values, universal in nature, that America could lead on and advance globally.
That's right. And the man he chose to kind of implement these reforms.
Yeah.
This guy named by the name of Charlie Wick, as you pointed out, Charlie Z. Wick. I'm pretty sure his real name was Charles Wick, but he decided to change it. Charlie Wick is a friend of Reagan's from Hollywood, right? They're neighbors. They spent Christmases together. Reagan's oldest son lived with Charlie Wick his final year of high school while Reagan went to the governor's mansion. I mean, Wick was a big band leader in Hollywood. He was Churchill's literary agent in the United States, that is. And he's just a kind of a really big personality.
A great personality to write about. I mean, you can tell you relish kind of being able to profile him.
There's a really good biography to write on Charlie Wick. But he really does frustrate the career bureaucrats, right? Because he comes in and they're like, this guy doesn't know anything about foreign affairs, right? But he does know something about how to get a message across, right? And how to do it in an engaging way. And of course, the bureaucrats ultimately come around when they realize he doubles their budget. Right? It pays to have the president's best friend.
Well, but you see this throughout the Reagan administration. I think Wick is one of the most prominent, but you could talk about Judge Clark, right? Who was his rancher, former chief of staff when Reagan was governor, and then becomes deputy secretary of state and ultimately national security advisor, and then goes on to lead the Department of Interior. No foreign policy experience coming to the table, but that relationship connection, proved to be the secret sauce. You can go to Caspar Weinberger, right? He didn't really have a background in defense, served as a secretary of defense for Reagan for 7 years. Or Bill Casey, all people, certainly in Casey's case, seems to be like Wick, who in the agency didn't really know how to deal with this guy, as a Wall Street lawyer. Ultimately, though, puts the agency front and center in the Cold War battle. And, the bureaucracy seems to come around. Maybe that's too favorable a reading, but it does go to kind of broader lesson. Maybe you can comment on this, Anthony, where, outsiders coming in leading government agencies. Yeah, the bureaucracy is going to be, skeptical at first, but there's a way to win them over and actually make the system work. They don't, as long as these people come in trying to make the bureaucracy the enemy of the administration, but can galvanize and bring them along, it could be successful. I think that's part of the story that you tell with Wick.
That's exactly right. I mean, let's take it from a budgetary battle standpoint, right? The USIA budgets are always cut. They were one of those agencies that the State Department loved to to push around, and those budgets were cut year over year over year, despite Voice of America probably being one of the hallmarks of U.S. foreign policy, right? Considered one of its most effective instruments. But WIC comes in, as I said, doubles the budget. Well, what does that do? One of the things it does is modernize broadcast capabilities, especially in radio,
Right.
which means that we can overcome Soviet jamming operations.
Which is happening all over, particularly in Eastern Europe and
Eastern Europe.
Right.
And all of a sudden, Voice of American messaging, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that messaging starts getting across the Iron Curtain.
Right.
And that messaging, of course, is carrying U.S. foreign policy aims, peace through strength proponents or proposals and whatnot. I talked to a lot of people who were on the ground in Eastern Europe at the time of the revolutions, and they say that the words and the message they received from those broadcast agencies and outlets we just talked about were absolutely essential to keeping hope alive.
We're with Dr. Anthony Eames, author of A Voice in Their Own Destiny, Reagan-Thatcher and Public Diplomacy in the Nuclear 1980s. He is the director of scholarly initiatives here at the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C. A quick follow-up on that last point. The impact that Voice of America, for example, was able to have within captive nations because WIC ups the budget, improves the technology. It can penetrate into places where Soviet jamming prior to would prevent people from hearing Voice of America. Just parse for a second. I know you touched on this before, but what was the Reagan administration response to those who claim Voice of America is just propaganda? And there's no difference between the Voice of America programming versus Soviet propaganda that was coming out of the Soviet Union.
I mean, one of the key things that Reagan's administration does with public diplomacy in general is engages in a kind of a two-way flow of conversation. In fact, that's one of the ways you characterize the difference between public diplomacy and propaganda. Propaganda is a one-way flow. It's me telling you this is how it is, and that's just how it is. You
Right,
take
right.
it. Public diplomacy is me telling you what I think the best policy is, or what I think the highest vision of society is, and you engaging me on that program. So when we talked about WorldNet, that was one way of doing it. We talked about other things like the wireless file.
Right.
Again, this little arcane feature of USIA, but it's the wireless file enables kind of the central USIA office to transmit policy developments, new information rapidly to kind of far-flung field offices. Because of its kind of update and computerization, or bringing that into the computer age, you could have actually like a real conversation on the wireless file. And journalists could actually be engaged on public diplomacy. So European journalists would sit in a room at a US embassy and ask people like, Ken Edelman or Richard Pearl or
some of the big Cold Warriors and arms control, negotiators. Yeah.
Direct questions about U.S. policy on arms control or
So it almost showed the transparency of a
That's
democracy rather than, kind of the talking points of the day that the administration wanted everybody to buy into. At least that was the argument.
That's right. Yeah.
Hey, the other piece of your book, of course, is not just Reagan and public diplomacy in the nuclear 1980s, but it's Margaret Thatcher featured prominently on the cover of the book. It's Thatcher and Reagan, and it looks like Al Haig behind him, but and it's Thatcher speaking, the picture you chose, and Reagan listening. What was the public diplomacy that the United Kingdom emphasized? And we talked about this when we did an event celebrating the book's launch, kind of what the UK brought to the table on this.
Well, it's funny you say Thatcher speaking and Reagan listening.
That's what it looks like there, right?
I mean, that pretty much characterizes any conversation with Margaret Thatcher. So far. I understand it. She
had a lot to say. Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting. The UK really, at the end of the Cold War, I think I've shared this with you a number of times, we generally think of two superpowers.
Mm-hmm.
That really only applies to military capabilities. I mean, the Soviet economy is certainly not of superpower status.
People with nukes and can destroy the world in seconds, right?
Right, that's it. But it comes to public diplomacy, there's three. and the UK is the third. And as I said, the BBC is the gold standard. Voice of America wishes it was the BBC in terms of reach, in terms of technical sophistication. The British had been, very much engaged in English language training programs around the world for generations. I mean, they really have their operations kind of humming along, and realizing that, their investments in essentially kinetics are of limited value, right? They're never going to be able to field the military capabilities the Soviet Union and the United States has, but they can invest in influence, which is very much how the British kind of have gone about things since the end of World War II. So Thatcher sees herself as a power broker, right, in the 1980s, power broker with the Soviet Union and the United States. And indeed, I will say this, in terms of cracking the Iron Curtain, Thatcher is the one who first gets over the Soviet Union and gives a live TV interview with Soviet press.
Yeah, and she encouraged Reagan to look at Gorbachev.
And she encourages Reagan to look at Gorbachev, right? We can do business together, right? Yeah. Which, by the way, is very much a staged public diplomacy event. The first Gorbachev-Thatcher meeting it's a tricky one, right? Because if Gorbachev is being seen too much to be a puppet or too malleable to the West, that doesn't do him any good in his leadership contest. Yeah. Which, when he first met with Thatcher, was only a few months before he would ultimately take power. So that doesn't necessarily win him credit in Moscow. The same time, if he's seen to be ineffective in the West, that doesn't win him any credit with the West.
So they're all thinking about how their public diplomacy is going to hit different audiences.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So Thatcher really, and the British government really kind of stage manages that process in a way that sets Gorbachev up for successful engagement in the West. So British public diplomacy very much is geared in two directions. It's geared toward the Soviet Union, and it's geared to the United States. Right, and specifically to the White House about, hey, we are real power brokers. We have a lot of influence in Europe, and this is the other part of it. So you could say geared toward three audiences. Mm-hmm. When you see the proliferation of think tanks in the 1980s, places like Heritage, for example, which was founded a little bit earlier but started to focus on foreign policy. Those become little kind of beachheads for influencing public opinion. Some of them focus more on legislators and governments, but a lot of them are focused on engaging the mass public. The Heritage Foundation in particular, which I'm sure many listeners to the podcast know what the Heritage Foundation is.
What it was.
Yep. Saw Britain as the eyes and ears for Europe. Right. So the way that the United States approached European publics was fundamentally shaped by the British view of European publics, not just because the Heritage Foundation said so. Yeah, right. For example, Charlie Wick, as I said, literary agent to Winston Churchill. Wick is an Anglophile, right?
As is Caspar Weinberger.
Right. And so the kind of approach and engagement the British take with the public very much informs how the Americans and the White House engages the Europeans on key issues like deployments of intermediate range nuclear force.
Which, of course, was the animating issue that, of course, Reagan deploys the Pershing II missiles and the Glickums, ground-launched cruise missiles, and then ultimately the INF Treaty.
That's right.
Pulls those back. Let's go to one other piece that really pulled on strained the alliance between the United States and UK, and also, of course, impacted the anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s. Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. You write about that. For you, one of the things you write is that in the United States, Reagan's public diplomacy developed an even stronger moral dimension with the introduction of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which disrupted the anti-nuclear campaign against Reagan's nuclear agenda. And so SDI disrupted a lot, right? It put the Soviets on their heels. It concerned Margaret Thatcher because she thought she might lose the nuclear umbrella, which her and NATO allies relied upon. It disrupted the hawks in the Reagan administration. You know, Richard Pearl famously, was caught off guard and was freaking out over this. In addition to Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger, all of that, are areas of focus. And you think about SDI, but you look at it through this lens of public diplomacy. Take us through that a little bit. It's super interesting.
Yeah, the SDI ushers in what we might call an era of mutual assured survival. That's the message.
Right. Well, Reagan needed a counter to what he hated, mutual assured destruction. Mad. Yeah,
that's right. And as I point out early in the book, Reagan doesn't hate deterrence. He hates MAD, right? And so throughout, really actually since the 1960s, but certainly since the beginning of the strategic arms limitation talks, public opinion and public approval of arms control had hovered consistently above 70%.
A lot of support.
Right? Reagan's starting to take a lot of heat on arms control because the buildup of leverage, the nuclear freeze movement in particular, is starting to frame as really the reason why arms control is crumbling, right? They're saying, oh, you're demonstrating that you're not negotiating in good faith. Reagan was pretty transparent about what he was trying to do the whole time, but the freeze movement, thinks otherwise. And so SDI presents this opportunity to Reagan really show that, no, he really is trying to engage the Soviet Union in a kind of good faith.
So just to understand you, so basically Reagan's doing the strength of peace through strength. He's getting the defense budgets, doing the buildup on the conventional side and the nuclear side, that's modernizing the nuclear triad, working to deploy the Pershing IIs into Europe. And so you're saying there was all that work was kind of strengthening the anti-nuclear movement because they're saying, hey, you're not serious about negotiating with the Soviets.
Right.
All you're doing is the strength side. Show me some peace. And he's got nothing to show for it. In 1982, 1983, at the height of all this.
That's right. They're saying it's lip service. And Reagan says, okay, what if we start investing in strategic defense? Right? What if we start thinking about designing and deploying capabilities that will prevent ballistic missiles from reaching the American public?
It's a total paradigm shift.
It's a total paradigm shift. There's a lot of debates and questions about, what degree of missile defense is feasible and how effective will it be? And you can get into the nitty-gritty of that, but I think the importance here is it's a paradigm shift about how the public views nuclear war, how it conceives of nuclear war, and how it conceives of Reagan's engagement with the Soviet Union. So Reagan introduces that on March 23rd, 1983. Arms control talks collapse in late November, early December. So
this is Paul Nitz's out there doing this work.
They're trying to engage the Soviets on arms control. But ultimately, the Soviets say, well, one, you deployed those INF missiles that we were saying you shouldn't.
Only we get to put,
that's right.
the intermediate nuclear missiles into Europe, not the United States, right?
The Soviets already had their INF missiles in Europe, their equivalents. And so those are gone, and they're saying, well, since you've altered the strategic balance on the continent of Europe, therefore we can't engage in strategic arms control negotiations. So those two tracks of arms control negotiations are essentially kaput. The question is, does SDI bring the Soviets back to the negotiating table? Because if offensive nuclear capabilities being what they are about equal, SDI changes the strategic balance, right? It means that Soviet nuclear capabilities aren't.
And in fact, the Soviets basically say that, that through SDI, the United States is either realize or will realize, kind of strategic superiority.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Now, this is where the public diplomacy game and battle get a little complicated. Okay, so first let's start vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. There's a lot of the standard talking point is, this SDI compelled the Soviets back to the negotiating table because they were afraid of SDI. I actually don't know if that's right. And I'm not saying that SDI wasn't a compelling public diplomacy move, but not for that reason. If you kind of look into the Soviet Union, now we're going to veer a little into speculation because it's tough to get access to Kremlin archives.
Right.
Um, they're not a monolith, right? They have their own kind of organizational politics.
Different voices in the Politburo.
That's right. So the scientific
KGB.
community in the Soviet Union was basically saying SDI shouldn't really concern you, Mikhail Gorbachev.
There's no way they have this, right?
No way they have it. It won't alter the strategic balance, what have you. The Soviet defense community is like, oh no, SDI, it's a real big deal. We need to kind of continue building up weapons because this SDI thing is going to change.
Now we got to spend more on defense.
Yeah, now let's raise our, percentage of GDP to 75% or whatever. And so whether or not it actually compels the Soviet Union to come back to the negotiating table is still, I think, up for debate. But what is, in fact, more interesting and more clear to me is what happens to SDI when the Soviets do come back to the negotiating table. There's a very famous summit in Reykjavik. It wasn't supposed to be a summit. It just became a summit. It was supposed to be kind of an intermediate meeting to get summits back on track. And in that moment, Gorbachev makes this grandiose pledge. Why don't we just get rid of all nuclear weapons? And Reagan says, yeah, let's do it. I can't remember which one.
But yeah, it was this amazing moment. Schultz writes about it, that these two leaders were on the table, had the opportunity just to get rid of nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons.
And so it makes this grandiose place, and he says, but you also have to get rid of SDI. Well, Reagan's going, why do we have to get rid of SDI if we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons between the two of us? Gorbachev says, well, there's offensive capabilities, blah, blah, blah. And Reagan says, well, we got to watch out for third world and third power nuclear reactors, something that seems pretty prescient today.
Yep.
But he refuses to stand down. And
Reagan will not give up SDI. And Reagan says what? He says, well, I'm willing to share it with you, right?
I'm willing to share it with you, which is really risky because I'm telling you, Roger, I don't know if he would have gotten that past Congress or his own administration, but he goes on a limb and says, I'm willing to share it with you. Gorbachev thinks he's got him cornered. Thatcher says you've walked into a trap. His own advisor said you should have just gotten rid of it or you shouldn't have put yourself in that position in the first place. And so we break from Reykjavik. Everyone thinks Reagan's polling numbers are going to plummet and he's going to be
huge political loss,
forced into huge political concessions. And guess what? The majority of the American public and the global public think Reagan was right on SDI. And so he called Gorbachev's bluff on it, which there's reasons why didn't Gorbachev just take SDI?
Right.
Again, we'll go into speculation, probably because he had been going on in the developing world saying, we should go about star peace. This was his counter to SDI. Well, if he said, let's take SDI, then his program in the developing world is bunk. But so Reagan kind of offers it, calls Gorbachev's bluff, and trusts that he has a better read on the American people and really the global public than Gorbachev. And the answer was he does.
Yeah, I mean, he speaks directly to the American people. He gives a public address after Reykjavik explaiing.
That's exactly right. And
public diplomacy.
It demonstrates that kind of consistent commitment to a peaceful solution. That's where SDI is really kind of the key winning program for Reagan in the Cold War. It's that continuing to demonstrate his commitment to a peaceful solution.
A favorite line from that speech for me is when Reagan says, listen, the two things I will never negotiate away, your freedom and your future. And for him, that's what SDI delivered, even though the technology itself, Reagan would admit as much, was not developed at the time, and it was a science project with a debate being how long it would take for it to go out and be deployed. Although many of the missile defenses and space-based concepts that we have today, which of course our military relies upon and really are the focus of militaries today, can kind of the origin really goes to SDI.
Yeah, I mean, you look, we've seen missile defense actually be fairly effective in Ukraine war right now. Right. That's not exactly this same exact system Reagan was envisioning, but certainly that you shift the paradigm about where you should put investment, and that's pretty significant.
Well, A Voice in Their Own Destiny, fantastic piece of scholarship by the Reagan Institute's own Dr. Anthony Eames, Reagan-Thatcher and Public Diplomacy in the Nuclear 1980s. If you like this discussion and you're one for a little bit more of history and scholarly insights, excited to announce that Dr. Eames will be launching his own podcast out of the Reagan Institute. Tell us about it, Anthony.
Yeah, I've had a good time guest hosting the Reaganism podcast from time to time over the last 2 years. But I think it's about time we get the scholars and kind of some of those public intellectuals their own podcast. And we're going to be launching a Rendezvous with History.
Rendezvous with History, great name, important word for Reagan historians.
That's right, which of course is a reference to a rendezvous with destiny, one of Reagan's most inspirational lines. We're looking to bring on about 12 to 18 historians and other scholars a year to talk about key questions of the Reagan presidency and really presidential perspectives and decisive moments in presidential leadership.
So we're going to be the place to hear about scholarship around President Reagan and other presidential historians. And that will put you back in the host seat, not at the guest seat.
It's a more comfortable seat to be in.
Well, you've done great. Let's move to our lightning round. As you know, every guest is obligated to give their favorites. We asked for 3 Reagan favorites, favorite Reagan speech, book, and quote. You can't name your book because that's, of course, the favorite for this week's episode. So something other than A Voice in Their Own Destiny on the book front. But let's start with a speech.
Ivan and Anya, January 1984. This is a point where U.S.-Soviet relations are seen to be in a kind of a decline. I mentioned those arms control talks. It crumbled, and Reagan kind of pitches this vision about what would an young American couple, Jim and Sally, talk about if they ran into a young Soviet couple, Ivan and Anya, at a bus stop waiting for the rain to pass. What would they talk about? Would they talk about geopolitics, or would they talk about their hopes and dreams, right, for their future and for their kids' future? I think it's a rhetorically brilliant speech, and I think it's one of those moments where you actually learn a lot about Ronald Reagan, not just U.S. policy.
You have a great quote from President Ford about Reagan with respect to his speeches. I hadn't seen that before reading your book. Share that one because it lines up what you just said.
Gerald Ford says something to the effect of, he's the only man or politician I've ever met where you learn more from his public addresses than you do from his private conversations.
Which meant it was a bit of a slight, but actually it reveals something deeper about his presidency. It's not he really left his mark on the speeches. That's what he crafted, he focused on, he edited, right? And far more than, kind of taking over a National Security Council meeting or some other White House meeting.
That's right.
Give us your favorite Reagan quote.
Ooh.
That's a bit of a sigh.
That's a tough one. Well, there's any number of Reagan jokes, which can, or, you may or may not want to attribute to him. This might seem like I'm pandering, but I think a time for choosing, just that, literally, we've reached a time for choosing, rings eternal in not only kind of the macro sense of American politics. I mean, we have our own A Time for Choosing speaker series, and certainly in the 2024 presidential race, you'll see any number of mentions to it. But just in your own life, right? I mean, how often do you kind of come to a time for choosing where it calls for deeper introspection and reflection and whatnot? So
the speech, that's a good one. All right. And let's finish up with your favorite Reagan book.
There's a lot out there, and I have certainly read plenty of them. I'm going to call back to a colleague of mine who we've had on this podcast already. Marcus Witcher's got a great book, Getting Right with Reagan.
Getting Right with, about Reagan and the right, huh?
That's right. It really tells you about how Reagan's legacy is kind of been upheld or handled by Republicans and the right and conservatism from the 1980s to the present day.
That's a great read. We had him here, and Marcus will appreciate that shout out. That's fantastic. Well, Dr. Eames, congrats on your book, A Voice in Their Own Destiny. Look forward to your podcast coming out soon here on Reagan Institute channels, A Rendezvous with History, and congrats on all your work here as Director of Scholarly Initiatives.
Thanks, Roger.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.